So it was only just a few years ago that I came to a realization wherein I had to be truly intellectually honest with myself about the issue of the problem of evil. Typically, at least in the culture in which I was raised and in the community that I've lived in my life, um, the answer to the problem of evil, at least in terms of why evil exists, why suffering exists, comes from the Bible. Now, first of all, it's important to note, I think, that the problem of evil is the number one reason people don't believe in God or choose not to, because it just doesn't make sense to people, especially in Western culture. If you're taught that the idea of God consists in a divine being who is fully loving and just, right? Then why in the world do we exist in a world with so much suffering? So it doesn't make sense to people. And the alternative to, that conflict is to just imagine that God simply doesn't exist. So there are two questions then. There's the question of why evil exists, and then there's the question of, well, what do we do now as a result? And so, at least to that first part, the answer that I was given basically in my life was the reason evil exists is because of the choices that humans have made. And so people generally point to Genesis and the issue in the garden where Adam and Eve disobey God and say that because of what they did here, evil entered the world. And this really doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, the fact that when they have these, get these curses, right, as a result of what they've chosen to do, God says some very specific things. To Adam, God says, okay, so now you're going to toil with the ground. And to Eve, he says, okay, now your childbearing is going to be so much harder and more painful. And these are very specific. It doesn't say anything to the variety of natural evils that occur in the world, such as tsunamis and cancer and animal starvation, um, and the variety of other ways that life experiences suffering. So, the realization that I came to relatively recently in my life, or at least the idea, that made me be intellectually honest with myself, was that doesn't answer the question. At least the this biblical response doesn't answer the question as to why natural evil exists, for sure. And I think probably a lot of Christians take those couple passages where God in Genesis chapter 3 gives these curses to Adam and Eve. I think they kind of just take those, even though they're very specific, and they sort of extrapolate from that and say, well, that's close enough. It seems like because of what they've chosen to do, it seems like there's some sort of cosmic interrelatedness here. And so, yeah, everything that happens in the world that's bad is simply a result of the fact that humans made this choice, right? And it definitely doesn't strike me as a good enough response as to why evil and suffering exists in our world. So then, fine, there are plenty of theological responses that are some version of, well, it's, God created the world and it is the way that it is, and we can't really know, or at least we don't know, and we just have to trust that God has some reason for it, and that's just unfortunately how the world is. But there's going to be some good that comes out of it, because we can't have this good world without some level of evil. And this also it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's like when you think about hell, for example, the idea that God would create a world in which whoever, anybody, goes to some sort of eternal conscious torment or eternal suffering, that doesn't make sense at all if you believe in a good and just God, right? Because there's no reason, there's no justification that is acceptable in this case. It seems like rather than anybody suffering for eternity, God would just as soon not create humanity or the world. It seems like that would be a better option for us to simply not exist than for that risk to obtain. And so I think it's very similar with the problem of evil generally. Uh, it seems like, sure, you can give the response that suffering is necessary for us to have a good world. And ultimately, even for those people that believe that we will live in eternal, everybody will get eternal bliss and nobody will be suffering for eternity. Even if you say that and ultimately we're all going to be fine, then the good outweighs the bad, and that's kind of the acceptable justification. And I suppose that's a possibility, but there's still something that feels really off in terms of the justice there, right? I mean, for anybody who has experienced any level of suffering on this planet, and certainly those that have experienced great suffering, it just doesn't seem like it's enough to say that, you're essentially a pawn in this grand plan that God has for the universe. It doesn't seem like it's enough to suggest that there are people that do just fine in our world, and there are people that have this great suffering and experience great evil. And ultimately, we're all going to end up in the same place, and that's fine. So I'm not saying anything against the idea of universal salvation or something. It just seems like there's no justification that makes it better to imagine that great suffering occurs in this life. So it's certainly not comforting, at least to many of us, that this is all happening just because of some grand plan that's in place. And again, for a couple of reasons. I mean, the response is we can't know. You can't understand it, but once you ultimately find out what it is, it'll all be for the better. But again, it just makes it feel like, first of all, it's unfair. It's unfair that some people have severe suffering and others don't. And then maybe the bigger issue here is it requires the assumption that God is who theists believe God is, specifically in the case of the answers that I've received, the Christian God. And this theoretically, technically, this is a major leap. This is a major assumption. And sure, that's why there's been so much work done on the idea of whether or not God exists. But in terms of the problem of evil, in order to justify any level of suffering, you have to make this assumption. You kind of have to make this leap. And this is part of the problem. I can understand why so many people don't accept the idea of God's existence simply on the basis of an argument. And I can certainly understand why the problem of evil is really more of a deterrent for people believing in God, because you're not just going to assume the cause for the question that you're asking. So ultimately, I think, the problem of evil is essentially a dead end in terms of the major questions, whether God exists and, whether Christians are correct and what God is like and all of that. But maybe it kind of leads into, that kind of loops you back to the moral argument. How can we even assert that evil exists if we don't have a sense of what is good and bad? So yeah, that starts the conversation over again from a different standpoint. But the point being, I just don't think that it's sufficient to look at the Bible and suggest that we have an answer to the problem of evil and suffering just because of some of the passages that we tend to point to. But anyway, talk to you later.